The scoreboard doesn't always tell the story. Sometimes the real battle is invisible, happening in your head, even before the first serve is even played. And as a teenager standing across the table in a national level match, our guest here felt it firsthand. The opponent wasn't just a player in front of her, it was the voice inside her mind, the nerves, the spiraling thoughts, the weight of expectations. She lost matches not because of her skill, but because of anxiety. But instead of letting that chapter close with regret, she turned it into her life's calling. Today, our guest, Dr. Sanika Divekar, is a sports performance and exercise psychologist who works with athletes across cricket, tennis, swimming, and beyond, and helping them with mental resilience she once wished she had. Now, her story sits at a powerful intersection: athlete turned psychologist, competitor turned coach of the mind, and her message is clear. Confidence isn't constant, but trust is. Now, in this conversation, we're going to explore a few things. We're going to talk about why game day anxiety in sport, in fact, feels a lot like a bunch of us walking into a boardroom and we have this boardroom anxiety in business or in a leadership presentation. We'll also talk about the difference between chasing confidence and building self trust, and how to reset after mistakes instead of spiraling, and why burnout isn't hustle. We've all heard this in the startup world as well. It's your system actually breaking down. Now, this isn't just a playbook for athletes if you are an athlete watching in, but it's also a blueprint for anyone chasing performance under pressure, which is, I'm sure, a vast majority of all of this. And this is Dr. Sanika Devekar's story on how the mind can be both your biggest opponent and your greatest advantage. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sanika. Sanika, thanks a lot for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. That was very eloquent an introduction. Very, very well put together, merging both of the things that I've been doing. Very happy to be here. And I agree with you. I think there's a lot to learn from sport, and I'm very, very happy, very looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's start with your origin story, right? Like, you've spoken openly about losing matches to nerves. Like, just take us back to that moment when you were an athlete, you were training, you were playing the nationals, and what changed for you, and when you shifted from an athlete to psychologist? What was that? Take us through that process if you don't mind.
Right. So my journey with sports started in 2005. Where coming from a single child, both parents into corporate, and the lineage of sport in my family, it was almost a natural organic selection, so to speak. So dad was like, you have to play some sport. The only available sport to me in my school was table tennis. So naturally picked the racket up, never dropped it down, took it too far to play at the national level consistently for 12 years, had the Air India scholarship. So that got a little bit of a boost saying, okay, this is a possibility, I can do better. Really, really enjoyed my time on table. And like you correctly said, and I think it's a story true for all high performance athletes where we lose more matches than we win. The win to loss ratio is always sort of tilted towards the losses. It still holds true for greatest of the great like Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, all of them, right? So definitely lost a lot more than won. The losses felt far more personal than the wins felt. And a constant feedback that I would get is, your technique's not wrong. Your top spin's great, your service is great, your footwork's right there. But what happens when it's 10 all, and what happens when you're 1 point advantage down, right? It's not your technique that comes to your rescue. It is that floating pink organ in between your two ears which comes to your rescue. That's the absolute testament to my athlete life. I started working with a psychologist. Fortunately, had very progressive parents, very, very progressive coach, had the means to connect with a psychologist, started working with her. And that was a very pivotal moment. And I joke about it now, years later, where it was supposed to make me a national champion. It was supposed to give me the India flag on my t-shirt, was supposed to take me from one Commonwealth to Asian Games to whatnot, but it completely played a flip, a 180 on me, and I came back home and I said, I think this is the job that I want to do. My parents took it very lightly. Of course, my coach laughed about it, but somewhere I think that Kida was planted in my head. And naturally started studying psychology, decided to take up sports psych for postgrad, eventually ended up doing a doctorate in it. But I think as an athlete, what I realized was a weakness. As I transitioned into psychology, I had a better, deeper understanding of what it wasn't a weakness. It was almost like a neurobiological cognitive response to stress. That's your body's natural way of reaction, right? The body does interpret, the brain is a very complex organ, it does interpret these high stake situations as threat, right? It does activate, say, so to speak, a sympathetic nervous system. It impacts your decision making and all that. And that is what I was going through as a teenager. And I think what changed for me when I started studying psychology and human behavior much more deeper is, I think it fueled my curiosity a lot more. Understanding the why behind the performance stood out for me completely. And the whole testament that the difference between a gold medalist and a silver medalist is the mind. Very rarely will your technique come to savior. Of course, you have to be very technically sound and tactically perfect and all of that, but you have to have your mind with you in the arena, on the table, working as hard as your body is. And I think that judgment shift that I had was very transformative for me, and I think is now a core of what work I do with athletes.
Just a parallel question to that itself. Like, I mean, this is just curiosity around, like, are athletes today a lot more open to seeing a psychologist, or do they recognize that, like you said, maybe it's not a skill thing, maybe it's
Yeah.
something in the mind? Are they able to recognize today that, hey, listen, maybe I need to have a chat with someone? Do you see, is that because the context largely being like, even in general psychology or general therapy, right? I think as a society we're still progressing
Yes.
slowly towards having those open conversations.
Yes.
Have you seen, like, is there more openness today in the athletic world, if you'd say?
I think I agree to your point where there is a lot of stigma attached to mental health. Just generally, it's still kind of a taboo topic in certain areas of our society. Not all areas of society are exposed to the right kind of accessibility, etc., for mental health care. So I think that's definitely there. It's a reality we can't ignore. I think in sport, it's more looked at from point of view of high performance. That's the first thing that comes to athletes' minds. And I think the Indian fraternity is now opening up that this is an integral part of athlete development. I think sports psychology is at that cusp of where strength and conditioning was in the early 2000s, right? And now you have an SNC traveling with all teams in all leagues, in all tournaments. It's an essential part. They have a very concrete seat at the table. I think that is where sports psych is currently in our country. Of course, this may not be a reality across the geography because access is quite skewed. Qualified practitioners could be like a concern. Sometimes financially, it could be a service which could be looked at as a good to have as opposed to a necessary as a service. So I think we are definitely opening up, but we have a very long way to go for us to be integrated in the high performance multidisciplinary teams, so to speak.
Got it. Got it. One thing that's, I think, one thing you talk about as well is anxiety, and this is something that's very common across the board, right? Like, and whether I've seen colleagues or founders or people that I've worked with as well, anxiety is very prevalent, right? And in sport, and we see that sometimes in sport as well, even more so. Now, you describe anxiety as being natural, whether it's sweaty palms, spiraling thoughts. And this is a very, and how do you think one can sort of normalize anxiety? Because this is a natural thing, right? Somebody, and classic example, some review is going on, somebody, and I'll give you the corporate side of the world, right? Somebody's asking for review, somebody gets anxious, somebody's put on the spot, they get anxious, some follow-up has to be done, anxiety kicks in. It's normal. I mean, from all practicality, what you're saying, how do you normalize it in sort of without letting it overwhelm you or get over control of you?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy because it's the same system at work. Whether you're an athlete, whether you're in corporate, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a lawyer, no matter what your profession is, your body system is same. It's the same system at work essentially, right? And then I try and look at it as anxiety is not the enemy. It is a signal that we really deeply care about the outcome, and the stakes that are very, very high really matter to us, right? Otherwise, an athlete, if the match wasn't important, would put their feet up, have a nice meal, and be like, okay, once my match is announced, I'll go and play. But it's not the case, right? From a psychological standpoint, I think anxiety does activate the arousal system, like I was saying. The catch here is it does sharpen our performance to some extent. So try and look at it as a bell curve, right? You are kind of, when you are expected at your absolute optimum potential, you are naturally highly aroused, which enables you to perform optimally. However, the problem is how we interpret that anxiety, right? Whether we really take it that, hey, it's a threat to me. And now it's whether we catastrophize it too much, saying, okay, now that I've had one anxious thought, that's it, my match is gone. or I've had one negative feedback from my boss, the entire presentation that I put together is of no use. I think that is where it really is a game changer to understand. So what I teach athletes predominantly is to reframe these symptoms, the physiological symptoms, the cognitive thoughts that come. So say your sweaty palms, your spiraling thoughts, like you mentioned, that's your body priming you for action, right?
Yeah.
The racing thoughts could be just the energy waiting for it to be expended in some form. And the entire aim is not to eliminate anxiety at all. It's like holding sand in your palm. Right? It's neither realistic, neither optimal, neither doable. I genuinely believe the goal is to regulate it, right? So I take them through a lot of techniques. I primarily use cognitive behavior therapy in my approach, but techniques like breath work, techniques like attention control, techniques like pre-performance routines that can help anchor you to the present moment, because anxiety is very anticipatory in nature. It's you are worried about a future outcome. So using all these techniques to regulate yourself to the present moment is something that I work with athletes on. Similarly can be applied to the corporate context. And when you understand anxiety as information and not intimidation, I think you stop fighting it. And like I said, it's the goal is not to eliminate it. I think that is where the control over it starts to begin. So I think that's how I would normalize it as well.
Yeah, I love the point. Look at it as information and not intimidation.
Yes.
The fact that it's a signal to your body that something is
Yes.
happening, and there is a way to react to that, right? I love that. I love that point. One thing you talk about, and I think you wrote about this as well recently in your blog as well, is the fact that confidence isn't constant. Self-trust is. I love this. Just explain to I know what it is about because I read your entire blog.
Right.
But tell us, what do you mean when you say confidence isn't constant, but self-trust is?
Right. So I think that sort of blog stemmed from like a lot of constant consultation room discussions being about, no matter what I do, I don't feel confident. The parents give the same feedback saying, you've done so much mental training with my child, but they are just not confident when they go on the court. And I think that's what got me thinking. And I think that's where I sort of say that it's not constant, because I look at it as something which is mood dependent, as something which is emotion dependent, right? And therefore it fluctuates with the result, with the form that you have, with the feedback that you get, say, from the coaches, from senior players, etc., etc. And if you tie your performance to confidence, you're almost riding a roller coaster. Because if your mood can go up and down and your confidence is attached to it, your performance will also go through massive dips, right? And in that sense, I understand that self-trust is far more concretized. It is different in a way where it's almost cognitive commitment to yourself, that I believe in my capacity. I believe that I have trained enough. I trust my preparation. I believe in my decision making. I believe in my ability to adapt, regardless of how I feel in the moment. Right? Because one of the most common things I tell my athletes is, when you go on table, when you take a jump into the pool, you are going to feel nervous. You are going to feel the nerves, the anxiety, the jitter, all of it. We have to be able to perform regardless of that, right? Yeah. And I think in high pressure, say sport or business for that matter, you will have days where your confidence is just down in the dumps, right? And if your performance then depends on it when you're vulnerable, of course your performance also takes a dip, whether it's doing a good review meeting with your colleague, whether it's doing a client presentation, or whether it's going for a selection trial for athletes, right? And I think that's where the self-trust sort of acts as an anchor, that no matter what the situation looks like, I believe and trust my capacity. And I think that is where I think training athletes to build that evidence of competence through, say, deliberate practice, reflection after practice, so post-practice analysis, routines and all of that. I think I train that almost like a muscle. I think that is where that sort of block came from. And I think that's how I've developed and evolved my understanding of confidence.
Got it. If I had to slightly reframe self-trust, essentially what you're trying to say is trust your abilities. Like, so for example, do the training, do the work, make sure you're like, and in the business world, it could be if you're a content writer, if you're a field marketer, it could be whatever, if you're a salesperson, are you doing the activities that you need to do day in and day out? Trust that, because if you just do that, right, everything else by nature should fall in place.
Yes.
Would that be another way of like sort of looking at the whole thing? So
It
trust the
could be.
process. Yeah. Awesome. Great. We'll look at one more aspect of this. Right? I think one thing is, with whether it's athletes, whether it's people in business, mistakes are common, right? All of us, like, we'll make one mistake somewhere else. But what happens is, and we've seen this in sport as well, right? Like suddenly classic players of the ages will be playing, they'll get out, and they'll very frequently get out. Let's say in cricket, get out the same way. In business as well, you'll start making mistakes, and they'll continuously start making mistakes. Like it's almost like one mistake spirals into the next, into the next, into the next, right? You talk a lot about resetting as well. It's like, and that's actually a hard thing to do. Like, how do you? Is it like a soft reset, hard reset? How does one actually, in sport, I'm guessing even more so, because at least in the business world, maybe, okay, today is a bad day. I go back, I figure out, I reset, maybe I come back tomorrow. In sport, you're probably playing a game. In tennis or in table tennis, you've lost the first set, probably like at the big margin. And you've trained really well for this. How are you resetting? The concept of resetting, how does it even work in these contexts?
Right. I think that's a great parallel to draw, right? Say if you commit a mistake on a work day, I think you still have more time to come back to say maybe correct your mistake. Maybe in sport, what is more intimidating is you lose 1 point and the scoreboard visibly flips against you, right? So the first mistake almost feels like a trigger. And that's true. You see the board flipping, you see the opponent's coach stand up, start clapping, you see sometimes the crowd supports, there's cheering, etc. But I think what happens next is what matters in sport. I think that is where the reset sort of becomes crucial. So when athletes typically spiral after it, it is likely that their attention is going to get distracted. They're going to move away from the process and just focus, okay, now I lost 1 point. Now what if I lose another one? And they sort of go away from, okay, what should my strategy be to gain the next point, right? And I think that is where that self-talk also sort of starts becoming catastrophic. I've worked with a lot of athletes who say that after I lose 2 points, I have a self-talk that, okay, I've blown the match away. Okay, this is gone now, right? And say this is more heightened when you are in a team sport or when you're playing a team match. Say even if you're playing a table tennis as a sport and you're playing for a team's event, every outcome plays a larger role in the bigger goal of the performance, right? So I think the first step to reset is actually awareness, and it's noticing that my mind is now derailing. Either it is conforming to my past related thoughts or it's running too much into the future. So I think that in therapy, in counseling, is where there's a lot of psychoeducation, we call it, where you educate the athlete about how the mind works, what happens when you make a mistake, what is the impact of your self-talk when you make a mistake, right? I think that is where it comes up quite a lot. And then we use tools like, say, self-talk interruption, where I try and tell athletes, like, visualize a stop sign or outwardly say stop to yourself. Give yourself that direct instruction, because under pressure, don't give yourself instructions which are easy to understand. Don't scramble information. Your brain is anyway working at a very high capacity. I think this direct instructions also stop the cognitive loop somewhere. So I think that's the first. We also work a lot on controllables in my practice. So anchoring what is in my control right now. What is the next action that I can take? Sometimes a lot of self-talk reminders, like 1 point at a time, one rally at a time, one service at a time, is something that can move their focus back into process and execution, is something that I do. Now, there could be athletes who can't have so much cognitive input, who feel like, no, I feel like if I pay attention to my chatter, I spiral. For them, I try and work around the physiological way. So try and have some kind of physiological regulation through breath work. So say like some kind of rhythmic breathing, some kind of longer exhalation through mouth, etc., can lower that heightened arousal almost, and then focus on, again, problem solving. So you have to look at different ways. You have to look at these kind of micro interventions almost, because on the court you also have very little time, right? Say in a business meeting, you might, like you said, you might have an entire night to recover. On sport, the time is of absolute high value. So I think that is where creating that gap between, say, reaction and response, I think that is where your high performance, or you will thrive in that, is what I've learned so far.
One, and I think this particular point is very common, I think, both in the sports world and in the business world, is around burnout. Is the fact that you said burnout is not a badge, right? And unfortunately, we in the corporate world, we abuse this word hustle. We'll say the hustle culture, the hustle everything, and to the point of actual burnout, right? And And I think you've also mentioned that the fact that this is something that you see in the sports world as well. How do you get high performers? And a lot of the times you'll see this with really high top performers, right? Even in the business world, in the corporate world, you'll meet someone, a young startup founder, etc. And like I've
Yes.
had conversations with people, they're working nights, like he's working 20 hours a day, she's working so many hours a day, and it's a proud thing for them. Hey, I'm doing all of this. I want to launch my company. I understand that, but you see, burnout is literally around the corner. Like the obvious thing that's what's going to happen. How do you get some of these folks, like let's call them high performers, to actually rest? Because we know for a fact that very clearly burnout is not dedication. So how are we going to solve for this? Like how do we get these people to cross? Because this is very common, right? And I live in Bangalore, and this is a very common practice around most of the startup
God.
tech hub here. So it's something I would see normally. I go to cafes nowadays. I only see people working. There are no more conversations being had. But yeah, I would love to hear the sports point of view of how do you get these folks to actually take a break?
Actually, the shortest answer is that this is one of the hardest conversations with high performers. And let me tell you, it's not just athletes. It's like you said, even in the corporate world, the entrepreneurial world that now where it's booming industry in our country, it is so hard. So I think the short answer is, how do you get to rest? It's very hard to crack the right code with them, because I think rest just generally feels very counterintuitive to ambition, right? Like you said, the social messaging is such, the social conditioning is such that I put in more hours means I'll be more successful. Even athletes, to a point where they know that they've sprained their ankle, but they'll still turn up the next day for training. They'll disregard the physical symptoms, the pain, the spasms and all of that, and be like, no, but what will my coach say? Itne chote sprain ke liye, what, you're missing training or what, right? That's the culture. That's the high performance culture. And in sport, I think when you want to go the longer way, you have to go the smarter way.
Yeah.
Right? There is a reason why Olympics comes every 4 years. You need that kind of preparation, marination for a high performance at that kind of spectacle, right? And I think a lot of education, a lot of conversation, not just with the athlete, but with the parent, the coach, if there are any mentors available to the athlete, if there is say a physio and SNC, conversations that overtraining doesn't mean the athlete is committed, and resting doesn't mean the athlete is undercommitted. So I think breaking those shackles is important. Overtraining, in fact, is fast track to injury, if anything.
Correct. Yeah.
Not, right? And I think it's the same in tech. It's the same in the entrepreneurial world, right? Where chronic overwork, say like working even out of cafes, is going to lead to some kind of depletion of resources. I don't think in the long run you're going to be able to sustain the rigors of high performance. I think the key is to reframe rest as it's essential to performance. Rest and recovery is very, very important. Now athletes have come around to the idea that, okay, I'll have active rest. I won't go for a run, I'll go for a swim. I won't do fitness, I'll do a yoga routine. I think that's where we've sort of come now.
Yeah.
But I think not looking at it as that rest is reward. I think my biggest concern is it being labeled as reward. It's not reward. It's essential for you, right? So looking at data, if an athlete has access to wearable devices, showing athletes that how sleeping better impacts their mood positively, impacts their performance positively, impacts solution-focused approach, concentration better. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also tend to tell them that, look at micro recovery. Don't say I'll miss the whole session. Try and do something between two training sessions. If you feel that one session miss karna is very overwhelming, let's try and do a technique or a routine between the two sessions so you're optimally performing both ways. So some element of micro recovery, and also then integrating some kind of rhythmic breathing practices, some muscle relaxation, etc., which can get their body back at metabolism as quickly as possible. So there are different ways and inroads that I try and find to this conversation, but it's a tough nut to crack.
It is rough, and I can see that in the business world as well. It's very difficult to ask somebody who's a founder who's working 20 odd hours, take a break. Like you actually need a break, but yeah, it is hard.
Sorry to cut you, but I feel like it's also true despite me sitting on the other side of the table. At times, even I find it very difficult. Be like, I think I'm done for the day. These emails or these sort of tasks are okay to spill over. I've done my appointments for the day. The notes are in place. The plans are in place. And it's okay for me to stop today. So I
Yeah.
don't think it's an easy conversation on the either side of the table.
Yes. It sounds, yeah, very true. One thing you've said, I think, in the past is the fact that athletes learn to see pressure as a privilege, and sometimes in the business world, it's a lot harder to look at it, right? Like pressure is
Mm.
in reality fairly constant. You're looking at business numbers, you're chasing targets, and all of that stuff, right? Like, how does one sort of, is there a way for one in the business world? And this is advice, like, you coming from the sports world, you've seen this a lot as well. How do, like, is there something that business folks can reframe the way they look at pressure in itself? And this is not just from founders, but from day-to-day folks who work, folks like me who run teams, people in the team, etc. How do we look at pressure? Like, I mean, it's great, it sounds great, pressure is a privilege,
Yeah.
but how does one look at the point of pressure itself in the first
Right.
place?
I think when I first came across the literature in terms of academic literature on performance pressure, tennis legend Billie Jean King has been famous. And that's where I pick up the quote that pressure is privilege. When you're on the center court, you are nowhere but in a position of privilege. There are countless people watching you. They have made their life possible and come to watch you. So you're in a very, very privileged position. I think that is where I draw the roots of it from. I think in sport and in tech, whether it's anything to do with high performance, there's pressure because there's an opportunity. And the opportunity, sort of the stakes are very high when it comes to the outcome of the opportunity. And I think that is where pressure sort of stems from. I teach athletes, or I sort of break the conversation in a way that pressure only exists because you care about the outcome. Right? You care about being selected in a squad. You care about you receiving funding for the next 3 years. And that's why you feel that every performance, every opportunity that you get, I have to make gold out of it. Right? So there is a reason, underlying reason, very, very deep, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious reasons for why your body reacts the way it reacts. And I think the same applies to the corporate world as well, where high stakes can mean that you have earned the seat at the table. There is a reason why you're in that position, right? There's a lineage of effort that you've put in, which has resulted in the opportunity being what it is right now. And I think this eventual cognitive flexibility and perspective change is what helps in managing performance pressure. The pressure is not going to go away anywhere. Today you step out on a state level court, you step out on a US Open court, the pressure is still going to be the same. You learn skills to manage it better. Right. And I think there are a lot of theories which say that even when two people experience the same pressure, they respond differently because their bodies react differently. So the way your physiology reacts to pressure, the way you cognitively understand it, the way your emotions then fall in row can be very different. It is, of course, based on personality, social situations, etc., and that becomes true in sport and in business. So I think that interpretation of, say, resources, I think determines the outcome of what the pressure is going to lead to. So I think there's a lot that goes into my work, and I tend to use a lot of cognitive behavior therapy based interventions to help athletes manage pressure. And I think I always communicate this to the parents, the coaches, and the MDT that I work with, that the performance pressure resulting into butterflies is never going to go away. The butterflies are always going to be there. You have to just get them to fly in formation. You try and squash the butterfly, it's not going to work. You're still going to feel that pit in the stomach, or you're still going to feel that my grip's getting loose because of sweaty palms. You have to be able to regulate it again. What we spoke about anxiety, right? The goal is not to eliminate it because you can't.
Yeah. If there were, like, as we come almost towards the end of this, if there were three skills, mental skills that leaders or people working in business or corporate can steal from the sports world, the athletics world, high performance athlete world, what would they be? If you had to give us three things.
I think from the top of my head, a lot of athletes thrive on having a pre-performance routine. And it could be Nadal arranging his water bottles in a certain way, or Djokovic sitting down under the umbrella, eating a banana. All sort of that helps them perform better. It reduces the cognitive load, anchors you to in the present moment, which helps you focus under pressure, etc. So say before you are going on, let's say like an investor pitch, or you have a very big meeting, I think creating a stepped ritual of sorts is very, very important. Now, that can be as elaborate as you want it to be, can be as shorter as you want it to be. At times, a lot of athletes use a lot of music, which helps them psych up or psych down basis preferences. I think that also works wonderfully well. And the only caveat to this when I say routines is there's a fine line between having a ritual and a superstition, right? Your meeting's not going to go well because you wore
Well,
your
true.
favorite socks.
Yeah.
Your meeting's going to go well because you've prepped, you've put in the work, right? I think that is where a little bit of goof up kind of tends to happen. And a lot of athletes are, no, I want to wear my lucky t-shirt. That's a
Yes.
part of my prep routine. I said, that's not routine, that's superstition. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
knowing what my ritual is versus what a superstition is, that would be number one. I think number two, which I try very hard with my athletes, is an element of reflective feedback, right? All athletes, when they win or they lose, come and tell me, this happened, but I know I won, but, right? And the focus is always on what didn't work. We'll almost disregard the positive, they discount the positive outcomes that have come, or sometimes even take it for granted. And like, "Achha, so much I had trained, of course I had to get this outcome now." I think that is where building that adaptability to build confidence, what worked, what didn't work. What can I do better the next time? What can I take from this and implement it probably different? And no judgment, just pure data for iteration. Because confidence will always come from repetitive practice. So instead of just focusing on what didn't work, I think a reflective element of what went well in addition to what didn't work will help a lot. So that would be my second. I think now what is very, very important is an element of controlling our attention. With scroll economy, with the pace that we are all developing in, with the pace that is attached to success and outcomes, etc., as philosophical as I might sound, it's very important to train attention control. We call it focus, concentration, whatever, right? It does prevent you from drifting away. It does prevent you from spiraling, does prevent you from distractions, especially when the stakes are very high, right? So practicing that between, say, what is my broad strategy as opposed to what is it that I'm addressing right now, where can I channel my resources right now, and training yourself for that concentration, I think, is very, very important. And I tell my athletes, and any element of mindfulness is very, very essential. When you're having a meal, just have a meal. You don't need a Netflix or a YouTube when you're having a meal. When you're listening to a coach, maintain that eye contact. Be in sync with the behavior and the mannerisms of the coach, and you will probably absorb your feedback better. As
Yeah.
opposed to your boss is giving you feedback, but you're like, "Acha, theek hai, tomorrow, 9 o'clock, this meeting, 10 o'clock, that presentation to do," and all of that. I think being in the moment and consciously anchoring yourself is very important, because otherwise, then again, what we spoke, burnout, stress, elevated physiological markers because of this. There's no end to that list.
Yeah, I love that last part, and that last line especially. It's so important for us. We struggle nowadays to be in the moment, to absorb what is happening. In fact,
Yes.
the larger this podcast session is around half an hour odd, right? Like I could have gone 1.5 hours. It's also considering the fact that our generation today, all of us, including me, we struggle to listen to long form formats of everything, right? And I think, like you said, practicing focus, practicing moments of being present there itself will reduce a lot of different things, right? Like just focusing on smaller. I think there's some great points there, and I think before we sort of taper off, I think one aspect in all of this, and I think it's part and parcel of athletes' life, is our system around us, right? Like our support system, whether it's our parents, our partners, wives, friends. How important, I mean, in the sports world, and talk a little bit about how important is there and how we should sort of embrace that. Because what also happens, Tanika, is the fact that sometimes we alienate ourselves, we
Yes.
get into our shells because of pressure, we take up all of that. The fact that there is a great ecosystem around us, even in the business world, in the corporate, all of us working there as well. How do we embrace that? Because it's right there in front of us. We don't even need to go anywhere. I would love to hear your sort of, yeah.
I agree. I think my primary anchor here is that it takes a village to raise a champion. Yes, the athlete is the epicenter, but there's an entire entourage playing to the tunes of the athlete and the athlete's goals. Right now, this can have parents, can have coaches, your sports science teams, your doctors, anybody and everybody under the sun who can help you perform better. Right? And of course, we're speaking about athletes who've got access to so much and so many resources. But I think it's important to embrace and not internalize their opinions, is something that I definitely would say. I think as parents, as coaches, we have to understand, and I always try and tell parents and coaches that try and place yourself in ways where you are autonomy supportive. try and give as much autonomy as possible to the athlete. There's enough and more research to tell us it helps in motivation, helps in concentration, helps in sustenance and resilience. The more responsibility, and I try and tell parents, you don't micromanage. As much as you would want to do it for your child, they are not going to take you with them in the pool. They're going to have to swim alone. They're going to have to take that penalty kick alone. You have to build these micro habits, beyond the court, beyond the arena. And I think coaches become very, very important here, because somewhere in India we still very, very have the Guru Shishya Parampara, where coaches are looked at as cruise directors, and anything the coach says, it flies. So, and ensuring that there is a very positive relationship between the coach and the athlete. There is the feedback loops get closed. There is psychological safety when it comes to being in the academy, etc. These are very, very important bits, so that the athlete feeling safe that I can make a mistake. It's not going to be career ending. It's not going to have an impact on my health. I'm safe. But learning through all of it, through these opportunities, becomes very important. So I think striking a balance between I can be trusted to be able to execute this, instead of I can't afford to fail at all. I think that is where high performance will again thrive.
Got it. Literally, the last thing I'm going to ask you, if you had to go back to the 16-year-old athletic self, yourself, and give that person, what's that one mental skill you wish you had at that age while you were an athlete today, what would that be?
God, I feel like the list is so long. I don't think I had any, but I think the most important that I would definitely say is emotional regulation under pressure. Because like I said, I think, I thought that mental toughness was about suppressing feelings and was just about hitting that one hard shot, cheering for yourself, and moving on to the next point. What I know now is awareness, regulation, take off the edge a little bit, being aware about the goods and the bads, not fighting that why am I crying on table and why do I have this urge to flick my racket. I think there's a reason your body's trying to tell you something. And now in hindsight, I think response over reaction, definitely. I think I've reacted there. I'm just glad YouTube wasn't, live sports streaming wasn't a thing when I was an athlete. Otherwise I would have seen the embarrassing body language, where constant reactions after losing a point, right? Not having any kind of composure, any kind of some sort of semblance to yourself. I think it's definitely something. And I think I would sort of spend less energy fighting my own mind, and sort of channelize that energy into training a little bit more. I think definitely would be less in my head. Try and channelize that more towards my game.
Emotional regulation.
Easily.
Yeah, I think that's a very, and all of us can take that. And with that, we'll conclude this podcast. For everyone watching, what we've just heard isn't just a story of a sports psychologist, a story of an athlete who turned her greatest struggle into her greatest strength. Sanika lost matches not due to lack of skill, but due to the weight of her own nerves, and classically put it right at the end, saying that if only she had the betterness of emotional regulation, things would have been very differently and happenedly. And her reminder is quite powerful for all of us, right? That confidence can come and can go, but self-trust is a skill that you can train, right? Mistakes will happen. The real game is how you quickly reset. And definitely for all of us, burnout isn't hustle at all. It's your system telling you to actually stop. And pressure, for whatever we want to say, it will never disappear. In fact, it is a privilege. Like she rightly said, it gives you a seat on the table. You're there for a reason. Take it, right? So whether you're a founder, leader, athlete, anyone chasing high performance, these are not just sports lessons. These are lessons for all of us to take care in life, right? Thanks a lot, Dr. Sanika. Really appreciate you coming here. And thank you for showing us that the mind doesn't just hold us back. And if we train it right, it can really carry us forward. So training doesn't just stop on the field, on the ground, in the boardroom. There's also the training of the mind. And I think you aptly put it through, but really appreciate you for doing this and taking your time here.
Thank you so much. I think I just want to say that it's your biggest ally. It is the only thing that comes with you when you're on the court. So it's only right and fair to train it for that kind of pressure and high performance. And thank you so much for having me here. It was very interesting. And I hope there have been insights that your non-sporting audience can also take away from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.